Hello, and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. As we approach Remembrance Week and Remembrance Day, we thought it befitting to think about war, peace. We're also living through another time of war on two fronts, Ukraine and, of course, in Israel and Gaza. But we're going to step back a little bit with R.H. Thomson. Now, you know that name, of course, because he's one of Canada's most famous actors. His credits on screen and on stage are far too long to list, but I will say that he won the Governor General's Lifetime Artistic Achievement Award, many others, but that kind of sums up how his work is respected. He has just written this book, By the Ghost Light. It is powerful. It is, of course, brilliantly written. And it is about war, it's about memory, and it's about family. RH, welcome. It's so great to see you.
Thank you for having me, Pamela.
This book, I think before we start, let's do why the title, because of course it's a stage reference that no stage, no theater ever quite goes dark.
Yes, and maybe that's a metaphor for memory too, because a stage is a place where stories are enacted and people journey into other stories. And our theaters, when everyone goes home, the show is over and the audience goes away and the crew is about to depart, they put a single light bulb on stage and it burns all night and they turn every other light off. And it's called the ghost light. Ostensibly, it's there to stop silly actors like me from, on my way home falling off the stage, but it's also there for a superstitious reason that sometimes we believe there are still ghosts of actors in the theaters and they need to work. And so we give them a little light. So I kind of use that as a metaphor in the book to say, this is your memory, and you go back and you start to look and listen.
Well, because it's what an actor must do. I mean, you become that person, but you must also memorize the lines and remember whatever place and time that performance is placing you.
I think so, yeah. I used to think acting is about, I'm acting a character and I'm being loud. I think acting mainly is about listening to the playwright, listening to the character, listening to the audience, most of all. But it's also about storytelling. So actors are basically storytellers, and listening is a huge part of that.
You have written here, the foundation of our imaginations are set in place when we were young, or so it was with me. We age, rebuild, expand, and repaint, yet that first structure remains beneath our feet. And that is how you grew up, with the heroes of war, the victims of war, the war stories that were told, even your little toy soldiers. But it was a different sense of war than what you came to learn was reality.
Well, the Canada that came out of the Second World War was sort of a different Canada that we are now. Yeah. And it had struggled through two enormous wars and did extraordinary things in both those wars and happened to be on the winning side. So that kind of refreshing of who we were in the 1950s, there was an optimism that we could build anything. Democracy was stronger, participation was stronger, incomes were better. And it really was the opening of a world. And young people like me were growing up in that sense of optimism of what Canada was. And then, of course, the complications arrived. And we also saw ourselves as a much simpler nation in that, yes, there were the French, but it was primarily from English stock or Scottish stock or whatever. And we are not that now. We are everyone.
So your memories, these stories that you tell, and you did it again. You had done it earlier with the Lost Boys and that performance you wrote and performed it, and that was based on family letters. This too, I mean, almost every man in your life was at war or had been, and lots of women too.
When you think back of it, I don't know, maybe Pamela, you've done it, and maybe people listening have done it. When you think back to when you were 6 or 7 or 8, you think of those older people, well, they were probably in their 60s, but you thought of them as ancient.
Yes.
And you sort of went, oh, yeah, who's great aunt so and so? Oh, Flossie. Oh, she's a bit of a bore. But they had extraordinary stories and extraordinary pasts. And many of the women in particular were either widows, or they weren't married because there were no men around, or whatever reason. And so they carried the aftermath of war with them and lived with that, as well as those who've been nurses, and I never paid attention. They were Margaret was a World War I nurse, for God's sake.
You actually wrote about that you loved your toy nurses as much as the toy soldiers, and and that we sometimes forget that part of the war. We lost a lot of Canadian nurses in the Great War, and their time and what they saw was particularly brutal, because they were seeing the ravages of it as men came in to be treated.
They saw things that they did not write about at the time. But then I discovered this book, an English book, someone who had interviewed those same nurses when they were in their 80s. And as older women, they were honest. They said, okay, this is what we saw. This is the tears. Here's the pain. Here's the wreckage that we saw. But the younger nurses probably wouldn't do that in terms of propriety and that sort of thing. But it doesn't mean they didn't carry it. It doesn't mean they dealt with a venereal disease that was ravaging the Canadian Army, and that wreckage came home. And where they placed that wreckage afterwards, kept quiet about it, or tried to, tidy it up, so to speak. But we know about PTSD now. So we know these things disturbed inside. And so it was in the women as well as the men.
It's as we think back on that, I mean, I always at this time of year think about this, because as a kid, we went to the Legion Hall. There was always a big ceremony. There was a big lunch. The women went down and did the dishes and kind of gossiped, and the men went in and had a drink. But the kids weren't allowed in there, and the women weren't allowed in there, and they told the war stories, but I think it was only the good ones. I don't think even then they talked about the pain.
Yeah. But it doesn't mean those stories didn't exist. They just weren't told. It doesn't mean they weren't ricocheting around inside them, which we know they were. So and that's another thing that I'm trying to write about in the book, is the stories that you tell about war are really important. 3 layers of stories told before a war, which usually prepare people for war, either a warmonger or get ready. The stories told during a war, which we're in the midst of watching it, A, in Ukraine, and B, in the Middle East. And these stories are chaotic. They're being fought for. Words are fighting as much as bombs and bullets are fighting. There's injuries not only on the battlefields in these middle stories, but also in communities fighting each other, as we see in Canada. And then the third set of stories are the stories that were told after the war, usually told by the winners, and usually about cleaning up. But the historians come back and the veterans come back and they say, wait a minute, I want to tell you the stories about the war that I went through. And those third stage war stories are really important, because if you don't tell the truth in them, if you're spinning a point of view in them, you may very well be preparing the ground to fight again. So, because I'm in the narrative arts, I'm in the storytelling arts. So the stories we tell bear about war and conflict, we have a lot of responsibility that I don't think we're shouldering. I think we're evading it, or the money makers, right? The blockbuster films that want to do the shoot 'em up, punch 'em out
that's
films.
the other thing. I mean, there have been a few every, the 4th of July, this and that. There's been a few things that have been pretty brutal, but we tend to look at it, certainly in this part of the world, from the winner's point of view, as you say. We were kind of on the winning side, certainly in 1 and 2. And then that shapes history itself. And if you don't tell all the real story, then, as you say, we're not learning from the history. We're marching down the road again.
And if you put maybe innocent lies or malicious lies, if you put lies in the stories you tell yourself, it's okay. It's okay. But those lies come home to roost eventually, which is why truth in storytelling is really, really important, it seems to me. And I'm sorry, I look at where Hollywood is going with the kill 'em, shoot 'em, punch 'em, chop 'em up films. And there's a lot of serious mistruths told for the name of making big at the box office. And I think it's destructive.
Well, it also makes us a little inured to it all. I mean, and it is the same thing as we watch this brutality of what, Hamas did. And it's an image on a screen, and it's hard to separate that from the images we see on the screen all the time that we tell ourselves aren't real. And then we see these that are, and do we still tell ourselves somehow they're not real?
Because I'm old enough, and I mentioned in the book, I'm old enough to remember the war films that were made in the 1950s,
right,
which were actually made usually by people who had been to war and had seen it. And so what was depicted on the screen actually had a root in reality, whether you were, making it a happy victory story or not. But the violence had a reality because the generation who made the films had actually been in wars, but the generation of CGI makers now, they've been near a war, and they're creating these violent fantasies, which I think have consequences. Not to say we should ban them. I'm not about banning those kind of stories, but we have to be cognizant of what we're doing.
The work that you have done over the years with Lost Boys that I mentioned, or The Englishman's Boy, or this massive project that you embarked on in the early 2000s. I think it was around 2018 that it kind of came to fruition, but the world remembers. You started out doing this in Canada, which is, let's get a list of the names, because sometimes all people have left is just a name, that they were there, they died, their life was lost. But then you took this around the world to see this whole issue from a lot of very different perspectives, including from losers of these wars. Just tell us what the genesis of that was.
I always loved Remembrance Day. It always meant a lot to me. I had relatives in both wars, but I noticed that my father was a World War II vet. He never went. And I thought, well, he's a Navy guy, whatever. And then I began to notice that they didn't name anybody. Oh yes, they would pick a veteran, or they'd pick a Silver Cross mother, but they didn't actually name anybody. And I thought, then we came to the centenary of World War I. I thought, well, yeah, we can do the usual, but shouldn't we actually name them? Yeah. Shouldn't we name the 68,000 Canadians who were killed? And not exactly resistance to that idea, but it was uphill to say, no, let's name them. So we actually did, in the first stage of the project, we projected the 68,000 names on the National War Memorial. We timed each one, and families could go online and find the moment that their great-grandfather's name would appear. And they appeared, a family from Peterborough appeared at 4:00 in the morning with their 2 kids. And I said, why are you here? Because I found out that my grandfather's name is going to be on the memorial at 4:10. And it struck me to the need to personalize it. And then, because we also showed that in Trafalgar Square, I got the money, I raised the money, we showed it in Trafalgar Square, the Queen came, and I said, I want to say to the Brits, look, the Canadians are naming the Canadians. Maybe we should. And then it occurred to me, because there was an Australian military attaché standing beside me at the ceremony, and he said, why aren't we doing this? And I said to the Australian military attaché, yeah, why aren't you doing that? And at that point, I think we have to do everybody. And so we set out to say, all right, have to do the New Zealanders, have to do the Australians, the British, the French. And then you realize you have to do everybody. So you have to do the Italians, then you have to do the Turks, then you have to do the Germans. But the question is, how do you actually persuade countries to join this idea? So now this project has 4.25 million names in it from 23 countries. And it has been pointed out to me, usually by European diplomats. They say, Robert, the Canadians are the only one who could do this. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, if the British suggested this idea, no. If the Germans, they couldn't suggest it.
Right.
If the French, but Canada, A, being a middle power that still has a reputation for fairness, and B, Canada now being a community of all nations, is the only people who could say to the Slovenians, the Italians, the South Africans, lend me a bit of your war history because we want to put it into an international inclusive project of remembrance. So there is distinctly something about the best of who we are as Canadians to try to do this. And so the response has been amazing. Well, no, the response has fallen into two categories. One is indifference, like, oh yeah, you got the names, which just boggles me. And the other is someone who came up to me after a display in Toronto, and she said, thank you. She said, that's the first time I've ever felt included on November the 11th. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, me and my family, we just go quiet. We go quiet for the day. I said, why? Well, she said, I was born here, but my parents came out from Germany.
Right.
And she said, we just feel we're not part of it. And that's the same for the Punjabi Canadian kid. That's the same for the Chinese Canadian kid. That's the change. You name them, Slovenia, Italian. They all sort of step back and go quiet. So the World Remembers is trying to say, actually, it's for all of us. I mean, a young Punjabi student who was working here, I got him working on we're working on Romanian names, and he's an IT guy. And I said, Balak, do you understand there were 74,000 from mainly the Punjab, but also India and Pakistan who were killed? He had no idea. And so I showed him the names, and he became involved. So that's the point of the World Remembers, to say to those younger generations, it's all of your families.
Because we do forget that November 11th is more about, as you say, those who won, those who were victorious, but it's also very kind of Western. As you say, the histories of a lot of the European countries or the Eastern European countries, they wouldn't mark this in the same way because of the circumstances.
Yeah. But the core, Pamela, at the bottom, the core astonishment to me is why so few people are interested in knowing their names.
I know.
It just boggles me.
I know we do
understand
it even in my small town. We run the names, and it's hard to even come by there, which is to, because you're dealing with the third or the fourth generation. And what was your great grandpa's first name? Was it Bob or Pete? And it's, but it is really important because it makes it real.
It does. Makes it real, and it personalizes it.
So where is this project now? I mean, it sounds like it's just going on forever.
It's a headache in my head. It's where it is. So where it is now is, I had a decision at the end of 2018. We did our centenary. It was great across the country, et cetera, et cetera. And I had to say to the board, what do we do? Do we hit delete? That's it, goodbye? And the consensus was no. At that point, we had about 2 million names, and said, no, we're actually putting together a database for history, for study, for students, and for citizens. So we now have 23 nations. I still 9 nations to find, to persuade to come in. The search for the names is ongoing. Like, I'm trying to raise money right now I'm trying to approach the Stronach family and say, look, the Austrians send us 700 names, and I know there's probably 300,000 Austrians killed. I have to hire people to dig that stuff out of I need money to do that. Yeah. So it's an ongoing process of doing that. I have a partnership with the Canadian War Museum, which has been fantastic.
Yeah.
So in November, they show part of their display in the lobby, which is great. And then we built, to make it more accessible, we built an interactive kiosk, which is the big kiosk touchscreen. So the student or visitor can say, I want to explore Ukraine or the United States or Ireland or Canada, or so they can go into it through the kiosk and look at all these histories, and then they can look for a name. Yeah. So they can go, okay, like Balak, Balak could go, this young Punjabi Canadian guy, he could say, okay, let me see if my family's name is here. He could go to the British Indian Army. So it's a way of personalizing that and for them to find out something about that.
I just took my 20-year-old niece to New York and took her to the 9/11 memorial where all the names are etched in the stone around. And of course, she wasn't born when 9/11 occurred. And so she wasn't connected. And I said, well, whenever I come and I go and look for the names of the Canadians. And she wasn't really that engaged. So I said, would you take a picture so that I could send a picture of the names to the families, the Canadian families, just to say we were here. And then she got totally engaged because it was technology. It was something she could do. But then somehow those etched names became real. They became people. So it's so important that they can do that and find that name written somewhere.
They do. They become real in a way. And that's what's uncanny about it. But I can't think of any other way we actually, I don't want to say reward, I don't want to say pay back, but remember with dignity and honesty. I mean, we have a terrible history of ignoring veterans who came back from every war.
Absolutely.
At first it was absolutely terrible. We got better now. At least they get pensions, but there's still veterans from the Canadian forces who fought in Afghanistan. They're sleeping on cardboard on the street.
Yeah.
Like what? I don't understand countries, and we all do it.
Yeah.
There's no country that doesn't do it. So,
including our own, for sure.
And if someone can explain that to me, I would be very, very pleased.
Yes, if we could figure that out. Now, you did a lot. You did also have some fun along the way. You wrote about a story of ending up on the stage in London, just you and the Queen. How did you manage to finagle that?
It was a very ambitious and very wonderful High Commissioner, Jim Wright. And I said to him, look, I want a projection in Trafalgar Square for 7 nights, the 68,000 Canadian names. He said, okay, you get me the money, we'll do it. Yeah. So I had the expertise in London, but I had to go raise the money from wonderful private people in Canada. And then he went, wait a minute, we're going to invite the Queen. And his story about that is, we put the request in on Monday and we heard back on Wednesday.
Wow.
And he said, you don't get that kind of response out of the palace.
Yeah.
And the fact she personally had, because she'd lived through the Second World War, she personally had a very strong connection to veterans, all of them, especially the Commonwealth. So she agreed to come, she agreed to open it. And I don't know, you produce things, but the moment someone like that says, I'll help you with the opening, doors open, funding flows, and it just, people sit up and take notice. And that helped me create The World Remembers. If she had not come and spoken, I would not have had the credibility when I went to Brussels or Bratislava or Belgrade. I would have no credibility trying to build The World Remembers. But so, you build things step by step by step.
And then you ended up on stage, as I read it in your book, because Prince Philip was kind of lagging behind a bit, and you marched up there, and there were the two of you. You and the Queen.
Prince Philip was not in the right order. He was chatting up Donna, who was the High Commissioner Jim's wife. So Donna was being chatted up, as it were. And I found myself alone on the platform with Her Majesty. And then she whispered very forcefully to her husband right across me. And, the cameras are on. You know about this. What do? You look aghast? Philip, you're supposed to be standing closer to me. Did I actually hear that? So
yes,
it was a great moment.
Oh no, it is a great moment, and that is just so like her, in terms of how she dealt with things, very, very matter of factly. The stories in here, and as I said, you've written about the family letters and used this material. You are, it's dark, right? A lot of the material is dark. because it is about the truth that you're trying to tell here about not the heroes of war, although there are many, but the horrors of war, because there are many there too. Did you ever have a chance to have those discussions with your family, which is, look, this is, you've planted this seed in me. I have no choice, but I'm going to tell the truth, and it won't always be pretty.
Interesting you bring that up. On the one hand, writing it was terribly difficult, and I'm not a writer, and oh my God, I don't know how writers do it. So in the drudgery and pain of trying to do it every day, one of the brighter points was being able to go back in my imagination and talk to them, and talk to the people I'd heard about, but I'd never actually known. And I had all the letters, but I was able to have conversations about them, which were imaginary, but still, I wanted to have those conversations. And in a way, maybe because I'm an actor or I'm just making this stuff up, I know them better. I know them in more dimension. On the other hand, there were very difficult stories. I mean, George having a venereal disease is not an easy story to tell, but it was part of the wreckage that happened to these young men. So you got to tell it. And then I tell the story of the smallpox outbreak in Victoria in 1862. Yeah. Because in the book, I try to say, look, the definition of war is really not just what happened on battlefields. That's kind of the 18th century idea of war. War is when you turn on a population over how many centuries and actually defeat them and coerce them and corral them, which is what happened between the new arrivals and Indigenous peoples. And in the middle of that, there was a very dark incident in which one of my relatives he was a commissioner of police, played a very distinctive part in this darkness that was delivered to Indigenous peoples. But I thought I had to tell that story because otherwise I'm a Canadian. Oh, we'll just tell the stories of the bravery and those who came back. We won't tell the awful stories.
Yeah.
If you're going to tell the stories, you got to tell them all, because it expands the way or expands the palette of the storytelling universe in which you talk about wars. And as we started off with, if you only tell the bright stories in the middle and leave off the difficult stuff, you're in fact distorting the memory of war. And I don't think we can do that because they're not great enterprises to get into.
That process that you went through of imagining these conversations, I don't know, this might seem like a bizarre question, but did you summon the shock and trauma, or did they?
I don't know. Maybe as you get older, you're able to listen in ways, Pamela, at your age, you can hear in more dimension than when you were 16 or when you were 6. Absolutely. And maybe it's listening. Like, I wish I could go back and listen to my grandmother's stories now, because I would be listening with a bigger antennae. God,
I have that feeling every day that I wish I'd heard better when I was young.
That's it. I wish I'd heard better. I wish I'd asked the questions. I wish I'd heard better. So that's one thing I hope the book does, is encourage, whatever, if you're a 25-year-old who reads it, go and ask your mom and your dad and your uncles and your grandmother. Go and ask for the stories. And if you're older, tell the stories, write them down, because they must be heard. In the book, I'm very conscious that I may have trespassed. And I have them talk back at me. I have them come in and say, Robert, you don't have no right to say that. Yeah. You didn't live my life. How you should not be talking, because I think that is part of the conversation. But some of the uncles who I had real difficulty with, I have more respect for now, even though they're probably totally angry at what I said. I would kill to know what they thought of a guy who'd never been in a war, writing about them.
Yes, and however you try, it's still a passing of judgment as how they would see it.
Yeah, but then again, I don't want to defend myself.
Yeah.
I put their names in Belgium. I put their names in Trafalgar Square. I put their names in Washington. So however I might question the war that they were in, I have distinct respect for what they did, and they've got to be acknowledged. So
you quoted, and we'll leave it with this, but you quoted Marshall McLuhan at the end of your book. All forms of violence, he said, and you repeated, are quests for identity. And that's a very interesting concept on the violence side. But it's also what you're giving them by telling the story, is you're giving people an identity that was lost or never given, even in some cases, their name not known.
Very good. It's like saying, we took your lives. I don't want to take your identities as well. And therefore, you lost your life, but I don't want to lose who you were. Therefore, let's name you. Let's think about you. And that's what we should do on November the 11th. And there's millions to think of. So how do you do that? That's the question.
This book is just, I just found it very powerful, and it was, and you say you're not a writer. That's ridiculous. It's beautifully written.
Thank you.
So, here it is, by the Ghostlight Wars, Memory and Families. And I think you're right. Like, let's go and ask our families, not just for stories of war, but stories of life, and stories of love, and remember those too.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.
So great to have you with us. R.H. Thomson, an incredible Canadian actor, but his service to citizens here and around the world in creating a memory for all of us of those who served and died and lost and killed and were killed. It's just so powerful. So thank you, R.H. Thomson.
Thank you, Pamela. I appreciate it.
We'll think of you on Remembrance Day. And I hope all of you find a way to mark Remembrance Day as well, and talk to your families about that too. For now, that's it for this edition of No Nonsense.